You're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson, editor of the show. Later this year, Americans will recognize September 11th, 2026 as the 25th anniversary of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center back in 2001. The attack was organized and enacted by Al-Qaeda, a radical Islamic organization. And while countless Muslims decried the violence as both a tragedy and as an anti-Islamic act, the following years still saw many Muslims and people suspected to be Muslims severely mistreated. Right after 9/11, there were nearly 20 times the amount of assaults on Muslims every year as there had been in the 90s. And while that figure has risen and fallen in the decades since, in certain circles, a suspicion of Muslims in the US and even an all-out hatred of the Islamic faith has lingered. One of the circles in which Islam has often been called into question has been the far right. Speaking of Muslims back in 2015, Trump said, quote, "Without looking at the various polling data, it is obvious to anybody the hatred is beyond comprehension," end quote. He said this in connection with his plans to prevent Muslim immigration into the United States, a plan which, when elected, he partially saw through by banning refugees from 7 predominantly Muslim nations from entering the country. And it wasn't just Trump calling out Islam. In 2019, Muslim advocates called on Fox News to fire Tucker Carlson for what he said about Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar and her Muslim faith. In a much more grave instance, also in 2019, a man killed nearly 50 people in a Christchurch, New Zealand mosque. In his manifesto, he named conservative commentator Candace Owens as the person who had most radicalized him. Candace, of course, did not endorse these killings, but her stance on Islam at the time was certainly more negative. But in 2026, a quick look through the talk shows and podcasts of Tucker, Candace, and other far-right commentators will paint a very different picture of how these groups feel about Muslims. The same pundits who once criticized Islam are now the ones defending it. To better understand the right's evolving relationship with Islam, I spoke with Matthew Schmitz. Matthew is the editor of Compact Magazine and the religion editor for the Washington Post opinion section. He's also co-host of the Against the Grain podcast. Matthew wrote an article back in May about the phenomenon of conservative influencers who have radically changed the way they talk about Islam online. We talked about this trend, how Trump measures up, and what it might mean for the future of the Republican Party. Here's Matthew.
Matthew Schmitz, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate you making time for us today.
Yeah, Matthew, thanks for having me.
Of course. Yeah. So I want to start off, obviously we're going to be getting into how a lot of right-wing influencers are talking about Islam today and how that's different. But early off in your article, you touch on the fact that since 9/11, anti-Muslim state sentiment has been very popular in the U.S. across the board, but especially probably in right-wing circles. And I'm curious if you could sort of track not just what happens after 9/11, but I'm also curious to understand what was going on before 9/11. How did 9/11 change discourse about Islam in the United States and at a global scale? Was it always pretty negative and 9/11 just made things worse? Or was 9/11 a sharp departure from how we talked about Islam in the US before?
Well, if you look at voting patterns, Muslims in America were often Republicans before 9/11, and then after 9/11, they really ceased to be. So George W. Bush won quite a few Muslims in 2000, and then in the wake of that, they shifted toward Democrats. So I think that shift has to be understood in terms of the war on terror, the response to the 9/11 attacks. I mean, it should be said that Bush and basically all the other kind of mainstream representatives of the right, at least in more respectable quarters, were always at pains to make a very clear distinction between Muslims and Islam on the one hand, and Islamism on the other hand, or kind of Islamist terrorism. And so that was George W. Bush said, Islam is a religion of peace. So he actually offered, it's somewhat unusual for a president to say, this is the true definition of a religion, this is the true definition of Catholicism or of Presbyterianism. But for reasons of, civic peace and tolerance, he was at pains to say that. But I think despite those qualifications, there was a sense often that the right was excessively or unreasonably opposed to Muslims and Islam. And without entering into all those controversies, I'll just mention one that you saw kind of toward the tail end of this period. There was a movement in the kind of very early teens, like 2000, kind of 10, 11, around there, to pass at the state level what were called kind of Sharia bans. So kind of a state law saying, there can be no Sharia in the state of Tennessee. And I wrote about this at the time. I thought that this was a very misguided effort because, people have every right to religious freedom as long as they're not trampling on other people's freedoms. Sharia, of course, in the tellings of many prominent, kind of more, more maybe kind of strident or stringent Muslim jurists would whatever include things like stoning or whatever penalties for apostasy, but also Sharia would just encompass things like buying one kind of meat rather than the other, which Americans have every right to do if they want. That you can abide by Sharia as long as you're not otherwise breaking the law. Just as a Catholic, it's not illegitimate to abide by canon law. Canon law is not per se a threat to the American Republic. So I would point to kind of the anti-Sharia bans as one area where this kind of suspicion of Islam, or at least of extremist versions of Islam, pretty clearly went overboard. And that was one point at which I opposed it.
Yeah. And I think what you're now observing is very clearly a difference in the way that conservatives are talking about Islam. And I think a lot of us have observed this, and I think your article does a good job of kind of compiling them all together so we can really look at it and say, okay, this is more than just a general observation. There is clear pattern of lots of conservative influencers turning towards this more pro-Islamic point of view. And I'm curious, when you take Tucker, Candace Owens, and Nick Fuentes are maybe the big three right now, and certainly the ones that you talk about in your piece, it seems like a lot of these pro-Islamic ideas have come in tandem with, skepticism of Israel. And I'm curious, how much you think those are intimately tied, because it seems easy to see that they are not fully disconnected, but how intimately tied do you think the pro-Islamic sentiment and the skepticism of Israel, how much are those the same thing? How much are they distinct? And where did this come from?
Yeah, great question. I think that certainly the two are related, and it's somewhat complex. It does extend beyond Israel, though Israel is, I think, the kind of white hot center of attention. When you had this kind of one thing I mentioned in the article is the idea of Judeo-Christianity, which I think is useful because historically Judaism and Christianity were often seen as opposed. There's a very extensive history of Christian persecution of Jews across effectively millennia. But in the 20th century, this idea of Judeo-Christianity emerged, and this was associated, in the United States with a kind of broad support for American foreign policy and belief that America could be a force for good in the world, specifically in opposing kind of authoritarian, totalitarian regimes abroad. But, in contrast to those regimes, we Americans, with our kind of Judeo-Christian values rooted in the Bible and recognizing human equality and dignity, could really help to build a more humane future globally. But behind that, I think, was a certain optimism about what you could call American empire. And I think that optimism has really receded on both the left and the right. And so I see, what I kind of call the Islamo-Christian right, not meaning that they are some syncretistically mixing Islam and Christianity, but instead that they kind of recognize a certain they feel there's a certain correlation of values between their version of Christianity and the outlook of Muslims. There's real doubt about U.S. foreign policy, specifically U.S. support of Israel, but U.S. intervention more broadly. So I think that is a really important factor in this.
And how much would you, if you were going to go look at, say, Tucker Carlson's show from 5 years ago, back when he's on Fox News, what is his language about Israel and Islam then, and how does it compare to now? Is it totally opposite, or was he pretty silent on those things? What's different?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to make strong claims about exactly what he's said, not having the clips in front of me though. But I've watched the shows, and his mind has changed. His tune on Islam and on Israel both has changed significantly, and that's not a crime, actually. People, you're allowed to change your mind, and obviously he has. I think that part of what's going on. I mentioned U.S. Foreign policy is one element of this. Another way to kind of describe this change is in terms of liberalism or a certain liberal order. I would say that the idea that we need kind of more freedom, a kind of Western-backed idea of sort of freedom, inequality, and tolerance. A lot of people feel that has also lost value, and specifically on the kind of certain segments of the right, of the online right, feel that. And there's a longstanding history of mainly European intellectuals, beginning with René Guénon, the kind of great traditionalist philosopher, who have looked at the West and concluded basically the West is bankrupt, it is decadent. And they say, well, what is less bankrupt? What is less decadent? And they look to Islam as an appealing civilizational alternative. So it appeals to them as kind of in contrast to the deficiencies they see in Western society. So I think another element of this that's natural is that people who are mounting very radical and thoroughgoing critiques of Western society as it currently exists will often tend to look outside that society for something that they can work with or hold up as exhibiting those virtues that we have purportedly lost.
Yeah, and I think that leads me to something else I wanted to talk about, which is sort of the divide that there's been for a long time. It seems like my whole life that the progressives were the people who were sympathetic to Islam, were supportive of Islamic integration in the U.S., compassionate when it came to situations like Palestine, or just skeptical of U.S. involvement in lots of Middle Eastern, largely Islamic nations. And that the conservatives were always consistently anti-Islamic. They were often you think of Bush as obviously a conservative president, and he is going into Iraq, and you see just there's this very clear divide that the Muslims are supported by progressives and they are not supported by conservatives. But the conservative situation seems to have changed when viewed on the macro scale. I don't necessarily see a shift for the progressives. There still seems to be a consistency with a support of Islamic groups, but how is their support, both the conservatives and the progressives, how is their support of Islam still different, even if there is a greater appreciation for Islamic values across the board than there was, say, 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are differences, and I think it is useful to contrast the kind of right-wing approach to Islam with more progressive attitudes. So, looking at Tucker Carlson, who I think has thought about this more deeply than any of the other kind of popular figures we're discussing, he, in various interviews, has talked about how if you look at Western cities, no one's having kids and there's crime and disorder. But then when he has gone to cities in the Arab Gulf states, he sees that things are clean and nice, and people are very welcoming to him as a Christian. And so he's drawn a contrast there, kind of pointing to Western childlessness, pointing to Western disorder. And I think that one can contest these comparisons, obviously, and ask how valid they are, but that's just, it's worth noting because that's the way he seems to be thinking about it. And when you talk to progressives, I don't think that's the same thing. They don't say, well, I'm really drawn to Islam because I'm worried about low Western birth rates and the disorder and uncleanliness of Western cities. I walked through New York's East Village where I live, and I saw a lot of trash on the sidewalk. That's not how they're talking. I mean, my own impression, and please correct me if you have a different one, is that very often the Western progressive movements, they see Palestine in particular, though certainly Muslims in other contexts, including Muslims in the West, as really victims of oppression in which the West is complicit, who deserve support and solidarity. And I think many on the right, like Tucker or Candace Owens, kind of oddly enough, increasingly Megyn Kelly, who I think has kind of followed a lot of the steps Tucker has taken recently. They would also point to oppression. They're not blind to that. It's by no means their perception of oppression. It's by no means the case that they are blind to or indifferent to the devastation in Gaza or suffering of people elsewhere. But the accent is a little different, and so with the right, there's a little bit more of a kind of critique of Western decadence. Whereas, I went to the first kind of pro-Palestinian rally in New York after the October 7th attacks. That was the next day on October 8th. And one of the recurring chants there was, from Palestine to Mexico, all the walls have got to go. So I think that's that's maybe useful to think about, because that line is also offering a critique of Western society, but it's not actually Tucker's critique, right? Tucker's critique is that we're too, decadent or whatever, and I think ostensibly he would actually, I think he would support border walls, whereas these protesters were saying, solidarity with Gaza, what the Gazans are suffering, people are suffering here. We need to dismantle the structures that are oppressing them there, and dismantle the structures that are oppressing people here. So it's a different thing. So the left and the right remain, I think, distinct in their kind of approaches to Islam.
Right. Yeah. And certainly I think, seeing some things, at least Tucker in particular, I guess, is the one I've been exposed to the most. He said online, there does seem to be, he does talk frequently about the humanitarian crisis, right? He's not just praising the, as you say, the more traditional values of their society, the pronatalist ideas. That's part of it, but you're right. He does. It would be unfair to say that it's the progressives are always being the most humanitarian and the conservatives are always just siding with people who ideologically they can get something out of. I think in my own observation, it sort of seems like this is a surprise to the world at large that this is happening. But kind of looking back, it sort of feels like this was inevitable in some ways. I mean, there are so many similarities when you think of a more patriarchal view of the world. Again, the pronatalist view of things. There's so many similarities that it's sort of strange to me how strange it seems. You know what I mean? That it feels like we should have seen that conservative Christians and traditional Muslims would be more easily friendly with each other, more easily supportive of each other than they have been. And obviously, there's so much a history of Christian on Muslim violence that maybe that's the thing holding that kind of relationship back. But I'm curious, kind of how you see that as like, should we really be surprised by this, or is this sort of something that was always probably going to happen?
I think it's striking and surprising, but then in retrospect, inevitable. I mentioned Rene Guénon, the kind of traditionalist thinker who kind of began with a conviction that Western society was deeply corrupted, and a lot of the kind of more radical critics of modern Western liberalism are conservative Christians or right-wing Christians of some sort. So I think we're accustomed to the notion that when Western society is critiqued in radical terms, it will tend to be from a Christian right. But actually, it's very easy to decide once you've begun mounting a thoroughgoing critique of the decadent West. It's very easy to decide that the reason the West is decadent is because of Christianity. That's a very easy decision to make. And so that's what might lead one actually to convert from Christianity to Islam on the right. And that's the course that a number of people have taken. Andrew Tate. There are a number of kind of right-wing populist European politicians who have followed a similar course. And you kind of gave reference to what some of the important kind of symbols or ideas are for such people. So a kind of masculinism as opposed to feminism, right? An assertion of patriarchy over against gender equality, the submission of women and the kind of rule of men. So that would be one thing. Another would be opposition to kind of financialization or financial capitalism, right? Islam has an extensive theory of finance, which places certain restrictions on loans. So you might look to Islam and say, well, they have certain economic ideas I want to draw on. And so, you see these right-wing figures kind of making that transit. And maybe one doesn't actually end up converting, but one can nonetheless look at Muslims and say, well, they have strong family values, right? They're opposed to gay marriage, which I'm opposed to. They're opposed to whatever transgender, which I'm opposed to. In Hamtramck, Michigan, there was a controversy recently. This is a largely Muslim city in the Detroit area, and they kind of passed a city ordinance that was designed to stop the display of the pride flag on city property. And this caused some distress among progressives who had thought, well, we're a very progressive city, and that's one reason why we're very happy to have a Muslim mayor and a largely Muslim city council. And then they realized, okay, well, there's a certain divergence between our progressive views and the views of these Muslims. Meanwhile, you have people on the right saying, well, if there's a divergence between progressives and Muslims on these matters, there's a convergence between us and Muslims. So I tend to think that just as we've seen this be an issue in Europe, I mentioned some populist right-wing politicians who have actually converted to Islam. Michel Houellebecq, the French novelist, in 2015 published his book Submission, which is a very penetrating, I think, description of this kind of right-wing attraction to Islam. Europe has had a more extensive encounter with Muslim immigration than the U.S. has. And I think as the Muslim population grows here in the U.S. and becomes a larger proportion of the population, we may see some of the same things happening here that have happened in Europe. And one of those will be a kind of right-wing attraction to Islam. But I should say, I tend to think the dominant note on the right will continue to be one of kind of civilizational battle, right? Of a sort of more liberal and Christian West that's kind of identified at once with greater equality for women and attachment to Israel and support for Judaism and Christian values against a kind of Islamic threat. I think that will be the more dominant note on the right, but you'll be able to see a difference where a more radical right or a more illiberal right will be more likely to show glimmers of attraction toward Islam, and a more kind of something more of a center right view will be more skeptical.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you about, as we see this growing sentiment on the right, it does sort of feel like a response to the way that Trump and largely that, his administration talks about Islam. And I mean, obviously, chief of this is all about his, interactions with Iran recently, and sort of the mocking tweets he has given with the praise Allah and that sort of thing. To what extent, how do these right-wing influencers and our current right-wing administration contrast with each other as far as their ideas about Islam and Israel too?
Well, yeah, I mean, trying to answer exactly what Trump's thoughts on Islam proper are is, it would be interesting to kind of probe him on that and see how extensive his thoughts are. Obviously, Trump ran in 2015 and 2016 on a Muslim ban, and that was really, really central to his campaign. And paired with his also repeated assertion in 2015 and 2016 that we were going to say Merry Christmas again, I think his campaign could be, in that year, could be very plausibly read as a kind of reassertion of kind of Christian, maybe vaguely Judeo-Christian national identity defined over against Islam. In 2024, things shifted a bit. I mean, Trump he ran sort of oddly to, well, maybe not oddly, it makes perfect sense for a challenger. He really ran to Biden's right and his left, kind of on foreign policy in Gaza. He sort of said, Biden's weak, I'll be more hawkish than him, but also, at one rally when people were chanting about kind of Genocide Joe, Trump said, yeah, that's right. So he really made serious gains among Muslim voters in 2024. Then we have the Iran war, and I think that is when you start to see such a strong break between the Trump administration and various podcasters or influencers who are very high on him. And one thing I'd say is that the kind of podcast influence sphere, it is institutional, anti-establishment, and sort of defending the administration's line is not, it's not appealing even when the policy is popular. Generally, media properties do poorly when their aligned politicians are in power. So Trump is in power, and also he's very unpopular. And the war he's waging is quite unpopular. So without in any way doubting the sincerity of the online influencers who have invaded against the Iran war, I'd say that it's quite natural, even if they were more closely aligned with Trump, on policy matters. I think it's a somewhat uneasy fit for these people to be kind of defending the administration. It's a more natural place for them to be criticizing it. So, with Trump and Islam, it's a sort of strange and complex picture. And I would say that 2015, it's fair to see him really campaigning against the idea that we should have Muslims coming into the country. I mean, I don't really know how. I mean, that's plainly what he said. Then in 2024, there's, I think, a pretty serious rapprochement between him and American Muslim voters. Then in 2026, I think you're seeing a really significant cooling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think on the note of sort of why it might be natural for influencers to pick out their biggest critiques with the administration and focus on those and make sure that those are clear as we are living in the attention economy, and we have to talk about even hardcore ideological things in a way that keeps people from scrolling past us and keeps people from clicking away. I wanted to also talk about your recent article, which I see is connected to this theme about the changing identity of the Conservative Party as relates to Christianity, where, for so long it's been a very evangelical run party. Now you're seeing kind of Christianity across the board. You focus a lot in your piece on Catholicism and increased Catholicization of the Republican Party, but I think you can also see similar tendencies with a lot of Eastern Orthodox believers in the U.S. who are more right wing as well. And I'm curious, how you see those all as connected to these themes, and whether or not you think that the increasingly broad tent of Christianity that is now homed in the Conservative Party is part of why we're getting some of these newer ideas, both with pro-Islam and more anti-Israel.
America long thought of itself as a Christian nation. Obviously, that description is always disputable. Just like anyone who goes around saying, "I'm a Christian, I am such a Christian," you might say, "Are you really?" but when Americans, historically described their nation as Christian, what they meant was Protestant. So that's really the kind of historical and sociological center of American belief. And it is notable that the right, which is the kind of party of conserving, it's the party of tradition, does have a lot of prominent figures who are Catholic, and you see, in addition to that, you see a growing kind of salience on the online right of both a more traditionally inflected Catholicism and of a kind of unapologetic Eastern Orthodoxy. And I really want to stress, kind of traditionally inflected Catholicism. There are a lot of Catholics in the U.S. The overwhelming majority would be people who maybe don't go to church that much, don't have political views that are deviate very much from a kind of normal, confused middle. And if they have any thoughts on religion, their thoughts are something like, well, Jesus says we should really be nicer to people and try to help out the poor. I think that would be a much kind of more normal version of Catholicism, sociologically speaking, than what you're getting online. But online, and I think this connects pretty closely to some of the trends we see in terms of the right's attitude toward Islam. Certain forms of religion are kind of useful and meaningful as ways to kind of transgress kind of modern liberal piety. So by, maybe by going to the Latin Mass, right, and or by becoming Eastern Orthodox and growing a beard and talking about the importance of patriarchy, one is rebelling against kind of prevailing social and cultural norms. And so I do think these things have not just appeal, but a certain kind of countercultural energy and transgressive charge in our current moment. And what did St. Paul say? Or Augustine, riffing on St. Paul, basically said, the presence of the prohibition increases the pleasure of the transgression. So he talks about Augustine talks about stealing pears in his Confessions. I mean, eating a pear is one thing. Eating a stolen pear, I mean, that is better. That is clearly better. It's tastier. You will feel guilty, but it will taste better. Both are true. And right. The guilt will make it taste better. So, the fact that these people are kind of define our sort of the kind of pregnant egalitarian notions or certain notions of tolerance by going around saying what you see on this kind of this right. I call it a kind of form of Christian identity politics. When they're saying sort of Christ is king, they're not interested really in the Catholic Church's historical teaching on the kingship of Christ. I mean, if you go back and read the most important Catholic encyclical on the kingship of Christ, you'll realize that it was written in part to oppose nationalism, right? So that the notion of Christ's kingship was in part an idea meant to oppose nationalism that the popes looked on skeptically. Well, today when people are saying Christ is king, they're kind of pushing the notion of Christian nationalism, which would really be counter in some significant ways to that historic vision. So they're I think less interested in the kind of traditions of reflection, maybe know very little about them, but they are seizing on kind of cultural markers, religious markers, whatever, to assert their disagreement with the kind of prevailing liberal order and just to distinguish themselves from others.
Well, Matthew, that's about what we have time for. So I will just leave you the floor. Is there anything else that you think we didn't cover that you wanted to touch on before any parting words about all this stuff before we go?
None. I think it's the one thing I would say is we've seen this in recent years, and I think we'll continue to see. The right can be a source of kind of cultural and innovation, and also of kind of religious connection in weird ways, and it works differently from liberal tolerance. But you can see kind of bonds forming across religious or cultural divides, really on non-liberal terms, and I think that's something that's quite interesting, and it'll be fascinating to see where it goes.
Very well said. Everyone, that is Matthew Schmitz. Thank you again so much for being on the show. We really appreciate the time.
Matthew, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. If you'd like to read Matthew's article, you can check that out in the description below, or find him at Washington Post, Compact Magazine, or the Against the Grain podcast. If you like the podcast, please consider rating and reviewing us on your podcast platform, subscribing to Religion Unplugged on YouTube, and sharing our work with friends or on social media. Religion Unplugged's reporting and analysis done by real people like me, not AI. If you appreciate the work we do here at Religion Unplugged and want to keep this show ad-free, please consider making a donation. Now is a particularly good time to give, since from now through August 17th, your gift will be doubled. You can find information on how to donate in the description below. Thanks again for listening, sharing, and giving. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode of the Religion Unplugged podcast.